The wind came first, a low moan through the jagged teeth of the mountains that sounded like a dirge for the dying year. Alara Hamilton, teacher to the 5 children of the High Hollows, felt it in her bones before she saw its work. It was a cold that did not just steal warmth but seemed to steal hope itself, a physical weight pressing down from sky the color of bruised iron. She stood at the single-pane window of the one-room schoolhouse, her breath fogging the glass, watching the first flakes of snow begin their insidious dance. They were not the gentle, crystalline flakes of pleasant winter days. They were hard, stinging pellets, driven almost horizontally by the rising gale. A shiver, entirely unrelated to the cold, traced a path of ice down her spine. It was the same shiver she felt whenever she thought of Mr. Alistair Barrett. His name was a stain on her thoughts, a constant, low-grade fever of dread that had plagued her since her husband, Thomas, had been laid in the frozen ground 2 months prior. Thomas, with his hopeful eyes and lungs that had betrayed him, had left her with little more than a worn wedding band, a half-finished cabin, and a debt to Barrett that was as vast and impassable as the mountain range that now held her captive. Miss Hamilton, a small voice piped up, pulling her from the spiraling drain of her worries. It was Lily, the younger of the 2 Gable sisters, her face a pale, worried moon in the gloom of the schoolroom. The light was already failing, though it was barely past midday. "Is the storm going to be bad?" Alara forced a smile, a brittle thing she feared might crack her face. She turned from the window, smoothing the front of her worn wool dress. "It is just a bit of weather, Lily. Nothing the mountains have not seen before. We will keep the fire stoked and tell stories until it passes." Her voice was a practiced calm, a shield she held up for the children against the encroaching fears of the world, a world she herself was terrified of. The other children watched her, their expressions ranging from Lily's wide-eyed concern to her older sister Sarah's stoic apprehension. Young Jacob, whose father worked the small, doomed mine at the far end of the hollow, was simply tracing patterns in the frost on the window nearest his desk, lost in his own world. The 2 Miller boys, boisterous and restless, had fallen quiet, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, the way animals do before an earthquake. The schoolhouse, usually filled with the scrape of slate pencils and the murmur of recitation, was now hushed, the only sound the rising shriek of the wind as it clawed at the log walls. Despair was a familiar companion. It had sat with her through the long nights of Thomas's coughing, held her hand at his gravesite, and read over her shoulder the letters that had begun arriving from Blackwood Gulch, the town that lay like a smear of civilization at the foot of the mountains. The letters were from Barrett. The first had been a formal, cold accounting of the debt. The second, a thinly veiled thread against the small plot of land the schoolhouse stood on, land Barrett claimed was collateral. The third, which had arrived only last week by a traveling fur trapper, had been different. It had spoken not of money or land, but of her solitude, of her delicate situation. He had proposed a merger of interests, a solution where she would come down to Blackwood Gulch and become his wife. The words were couched in the language of chivalry, but the meaning was as sharp and ugly as a shard of broken glass. He was not offering marriage. He was claiming property. She had burned the letter, but the words were seared into her memory. The thought of his clammy hands, his condescending smile, his eyes that held the flat, possessive gleam of the man who had never been denied anything, made her stomach clench with a sickness that was part fear, part revulsion. She would rather starve in this wilderness. She would rather freeze in this storm. But it was not just her own life she had to consider. The school, this small bastion of hope she had built with Thomas, served the children of the families too poor or too stubborn to live in the shadow of the company towns. If Barrett took the land, he would extinguish this light, and the thought of that was more painful than any personal fear. The wind howled, a chorus of tortured souls. The snow was no longer falling. It was a solid, churning wall of white that erased the world, rendering the familiar shapes of the pines and the looming peaks into vague, monstrous ghosts. The path home for the children was already gone, swallowed by the blizzard. They were trapped. Her charges, her responsibility, all trapped with her in this small wooden box against the fury of the storm. "All right," she announced, her voice a little too loud in the sudden silence. "Lesson time is over for today. Jacob, will you help me move the desks back? Boys, I need more wood for the stove. The driest pieces from the lean-to. Sarah, you and Lily can help me prepare some of the salted pork and biscuits." Activity was the only antidote to fear. She moved with a purpose she did not feel, directing the children, creating a small bubble of domesticity against the elemental chaos outside. The Miller boys, grateful for a physical task, wrestled the door open against the wind and plunged into the blinding white, returning moments later, covered in snow, their arms laden with split logs. Jacob, quiet and methodical, helped her push the heavy wooden desks against the walls, clearing the center of the room. Sarah and Lily, working with a solemnity that belied their years, laid out the meager stores from the pantry. As she worked, a part of her mind was a frantic calculator. She had enough wood, if she was careful, for 2 days, maybe 3. Enough salted pork, flour, and dried beans for a week if they were frugal. The water barrel was full. They could survive. The thought was both a comfort and a new source of terror. Surviving the storm only meant she would have to face Barrett when it was over. The blizzard was a temporary reprieve, a prison that kept her safe for a little while longer. Night fell abruptly, a suffocating blanket of black and white. The world shrank to the small, flickering circle of light cast by the pot-bellied stove and the 2 lanterns she had lit. The children were huddled together on a collection of blankets and spare coats near the hearth, their earlier anxiety soothed by full bellies and the hypnotic dance of the flames. Alara sat on a low stool, a rifle across her lap. It had been Thomas's. She did not know how to use it, but its cold, heavy weight was a strange comfort, a solid reality in a world that felt like it was dissolving into wind and snow. She was listening to the storm, trying to decipher its language. It was no longer just howling. It was a physical assault. The log walls groaned under the pressure. The roof shuddered with the weight of the accumulating snow. Every so often, a sound like a cannon shot would echo through the hollow as a tree, overburdened, finally surrendered, its branches snapping with reports that were swallowed almost instantly by the gale. She thought of the families of these children in their own small cabins, worrying. They knew their children were with her, knew she would protect them, but that knowledge would be small comfort against a storm of this magnitude. It was in a brief lull, a sudden, eerie silence as the wind drew a breath, that she heard it. A sound that did not belong to the storm. A rhythmic, desperate thudding. It was coming from the door. Her heart leaped in her throat, a frantic, trapped bird. Her first thought was Barrett. Had he come through this? Was his malice so great that he could command the very elements? The idea was absurd, but fear was not rational. She tightened her grip on the rifle, the wood smooth and cold beneath her trembling fingers. The thudding came again, weaker this time, followed by a heavy, scraping sound, as if a great weight had slumped against the wood. The children were asleep, their breathing soft and even. She could not risk waking them, panicking them. She rose slowly, every muscle screaming in protest, and crept toward the door. The rifle felt clumsy and alien in her hands. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice a reedy whisper swallowed by the wind, which had returned with renewed fury. There was no answer, only the unceasing roar of the blizzard. Perhaps she had imagined it. A branch thrown by the wind, a drift of snow collapsing against the wall. She waited, her body rigid, listening. Nothing. She was about to turn away, to dismiss it as a phantom of her frayed nerves, when she heard it again, a low groan, unmistakably human. It was a sound of pure misery, of a creature at the very end of its endurance. Compassion warred with terror. It could be a trick, one of Barrett's men, sent to gain entry. But who could survive out there? What kind of man would travel in a storm that could strip flesh from bone? The groan came again, a raw, guttural sound that seemed torn from the very depths of a man's soul. It was the sound of death. She could not leave someone to die, not even a stranger. not even a potential threat. It was not in her nature. Placing the rifle carefully against the wall, she took a deep breath and slid the heavy iron bolt that secured the door. The wind caught the heavy planking and threw it inward, slamming it against the wall with a deafening crash. A blast of frigid air and blinding snow exploded into the room, extinguishing one of the lanterns and sending papers flying. And with the snow, a man fell. He did not step or stumble. He simply collapsed over the threshold, a mountain of dark pelts and leather that landed with a heavy, final thud on the floorboards. He lay face down, a tangle of long, dark hair matted with snow, and something else, something dark and wet. The blizzard raged through the open doorway, a ravenous beast trying to devour the small pocket of warmth she had created. For a moment, Alara was frozen, staring at the enormous figure sprawled on her floor. He was huge, far larger than any man she had ever seen up close. His shoulders, even beneath the layers of what looked like bearskin and buckskin, were immense. One hand was clenched around the hilt of a large knife sheathed at his belt. The other was outstretched, fingers half buried in the snow that had blown in with him. The cold snapped her out of her paralysis. The children. She had to get the door closed. With a strength born of desperation, she threw her entire body against the heavy wood, fighting the impossible pressure of the wind. It was like trying to push back the mountain itself. Inch by agonizing inch, she forced it shut, the storm screaming in protest. She fumbled with the bolt, her fingers numb and clumsy, and finally slammed it home. The schoolhouse was sealed once more, but the silence that followed was more terrifying than the storm's roar. The man had not moved. The snow around him was beginning to melt, creating a dirty puddle on the floor. In the flickering lamplight, she could see the dark stain on his hair was spreading. It was blood. She knelt beside him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was a terrifying sight, a creature born of the wilderness itself. His clothes were crudely stitched but functional, made for survival, not society. A long, jagged scar ran from his temple into his hairline, a pale track against his weather-beaten skin. His face, what she could see of it, was all hard angles and shadow, covered in a thick, untrimmed beard. He smelled of pine and wet animal fur and blood. Hesitantly, she reached out and placed 2 fingers against the side of his neck, searching for a pulse. His skin was shockingly cold, but beneath it, she felt it, a slow, thready beat. A flicker of life in the frozen giant. He was alive, and he was her responsibility now, another life delivered into her care by the storm. She looked from the terrifying, unconscious man on her floor to the sleeping, innocent children by the fire, and a wave of despair so profound it was almost dizzying washed over her. She was not a rescuer. She was a teacher, a widow, a woman hunted and cornered. And now her tiny, fragile sanctuary held not only 5 vulnerable children, but also a wounded, wild thing that had dragged itself out of the heart of the blizzard. She did not know if she had just let in a savior, or the very devil the storm had been trying to claim. The man was too heavy to move. It was like trying to shift a fallen oak. Alara managed, with immense effort, to drag him a few more feet inside, away from the puddle of melting snow by the door, his heavy boots leaving muddy streaks on her clean-hewn floorboards. She worked in the dim, flickering light, her breath pluming in the chilled air. Getting the door shut had not been enough to fight back the wave of cold that had invaded her small sanctuary. The stove seemed to be fighting a losing battle, its warmth a small, fragile island in an ocean of encroaching frost. She had to see to his wound. Taking another of the blankets intended for the children, she rolled it and wedged it beneath his head, turning his face gently toward the light. The blood was coming from a deep, ugly gash high on his forehead, just at the hairline. It was matted with ice and dirt, a brutal-looking injury. It looked less like a cut and more like something had tried to tear a piece of his scalp away. Perhaps he had fallen, striking his head on a rock. In this storm, that alone would be a death sentence. With a sigh that seemed to pull all the weariness of the world from her lungs, she went to her small store of medical supplies. It was not much, a tin of lye soap, a few rolls of clean linen bandages, a bottle of whiskey for cleaning wounds, and a needle and thread for stitches. She had become adept at minor doctoring, tending to the cuts, scrapes, and fevers of the hollow folk who had no access to a real physician. But this was different. This was a wound on a man who looked like he wrestled bears for sport. She returned with a basin of warm water and a cloth. Kneeling beside him again, she began to clean the injury. Her hands, to her own surprise, were steady. The act of doing something, of focusing on a task, pushed her fear into a corner of her mind. As she gently wiped away the blood and grime, she studied his face. It was not a soft face. It was a landscape carved by hardship, with lines around his eyes that spoke of countless hours squinting into the sun and wind. The scar she had noticed before was old and silvered, but there were others. A faint, white line across the bridge of his nose, a pucker of tissue just below his jawline in his thick beard. This was a man well acquainted with violence. Yet, in unconsciousness, the harshness was softened. His mouth, partially hidden by his beard, was not set in a cruel line. There was a stillness to him, a profound exhaustion that seemed to radiate from his very bones. Whatever battle he had been fighting with the storm, he had lost, and only dumb luck or a will of iron had gotten him to her door. As she worked, her fingers brushing against the rough texture of his skin, a strange and unwelcome thought surfaced. No one had ever looked at her with the desperation that had been in that final, fading groan she had heard through the door. Men had looked at her with desire, with pity, with condescension, but not with the raw, elemental need of a dying creature seeking shelter. The wound was deep, a ragged tear in the skin that would surely need stitching. She cleaned it as best she could, then poured a small amount of whiskey onto the cloth and pressed it against the gush. Even in his unconscious state, the man's body reacted. A low hiss of breath escaped his lips, and his entire frame went rigid, a massive flex of muscle that made her flinch back. For a terrifying second, she thought he might wake, that he might lash out. But then the tension subsided, and he sank back into stillness. Her hands trembled now. The sheer, dormant power in him was palpable. He was an apex predator, wounded and temporarily docile, but a predator nonetheless. What had she brought into her little fold of lambs? She looked over at the sleeping children, their faces serene in the firelight. Lily had one arm thrown over her sister, a gesture of unconscious comfort. The sight solidified her resolve. She could not afford to be afraid. She had to be practical. She had to be the protector. Stitching the wound was a grim, painstaking process. She threaded the needle with a piece of her strongest thread, sterilized it in the flame of the lantern until it glowed red, and then, taking a deep breath, she began to close the gush. Her stitches were small and neat, a skill learned from mending clothes, not flesh. With each pass of the needle, she expected him to wake, to cry out, to grab her wrist with one of his huge, scarred hands. But he remained utterly still, lost in whatever dark country his mind now inhabited. When she was finished, she tied off the thread and covered her handiwork with a clean linen pad, securing it with a bandage wrapped around his head. Her work was done. There was nothing more she could do for him but let him rest and pray he did not have fever. She spent the rest of the night in the stool, the rifle once again across her lap, watching him. She did not sleep. She listened to the two distinct rhythms in the room, the soft, innocent breathing of the children and the slow, heavy breaths of the wounded giant. They were two opposing forces, two worlds that had collided in her schoolhouse. The storm continued its assault outside, a constant, roaring reminder of their isolation. Sometime in the deepest hours of the night, as she stared at the stranger's face, a face that was becoming strangely familiar, she gave him a name in her mind. Silas. It was a name from a book she had once read about a man of the woods. It seemed to fit the raw, untamed presence of the man on her floor. The first hint of dawn was not a light, but a subtle lessening of the oppressive dark. The world outside the window was no longer black, but a deep, bruised purple. The wind had lessened its shriek to a steady, mournful howl. Snow was still falling, but more gently now. Alara ached in every joint. Her eyes were gritty from lack of sleep, her mind a dull fog of exhaustion. A small sound from near the stove made her turn. It was Lily, awake and sitting up, her blanket clutched to her chin. Her eyes were fixed on the man on the floor. They were wide with a mixture of fear and childish curiosity. Alara put a finger to her lips, and the little girl nodded, her gaze not leaving the stranger. Alara rose stiffly and went to the girl, kneeling beside her. "He was hurt in the storm," she whispered, keeping her voice low so as not to wake the others. "I'm helping him." "Is he a bad man?" Lily whispered back, her voice trembling slightly. "I do not think so," Alara said, though she was not at all certain. "Bad men do not usually fall down when you open the door. Now, let's be very quiet. He needs to sleep to get better." She busied herself with the stove, adding fresh logs and coaxing the embers back to a cheerful blaze. The routine was comforting. She put a pot of water on to heat for oatmeal, the simple domestic act of rebellion against the chaos that had invaded her life. The other children began to stir, one by one, their waking marked by the same silent, fearful curiosity that Lily had shown. Alara explained the situation in the same hushed, reassuring tones. They accepted it with the simple faith children have in the adults they trust. He was a hurt man. Miss Hamilton was helping him. For now, that was enough. They ate their breakfast in a strange, reverent silence, huddled on their blankets, all of them casting furtive glances at the unconscious man. He had not moved all night. His breathing was still slow and deep, but his skin, when she had dared to touch his brow, felt warmer than it should have been. A fever was setting in. It was mid-morning when he finally stirred. It began with a low moan, a sound that rumbled deep in his chest. His brow furrowed beneath the bandage, and his head moved restlessly from side to side. Alara was instantly at his side, a damp cloth in her hand. The children, who had been engaged in a quiet game of checkers, froze and watched, a small flock of nervous sparrows. His eyes fluttered open. They were not the dull, unfocused eyes of a man lost in fever. They were sharp, intelligent, and in startling shade of pale gray, like a winter sky just before a snow. And they were filled with a wild, cornered animal panic. He tried to sit up, his body moving with a sudden, explosive power that shocked her. "Easy," she said, putting a hand on his shoulder. It was like trying to hold down a rising boulder. "You are safe. You are hurt. You collapsed at my door." His eyes darted around the room, taking in the stove, the desks pushed against the wall, and finally, the children huddled together, watching him. The sight of them seemed to have a profound effect. The panic in his eyes did not vanish, but it was banked, replaced by a wary, assessing stillness. He stopped fighting her hand and slowly, stiffly, pushed himself into a sitting position, his back against the log wall. The effort cost him. A sheen of sweat broke out on his brow, and his face went pale beneath its tan. He stared at her, his gray eyes narrowed. He did not speak. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He was like a great, wary grizzly, suddenly finding itself in a pen with a flock of sheep and their shepherdess. He was trying to decide if she was a threat. Alara met his gaze without flinching, though her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She would not show fear, not in front of the children. "My name is Alara Hamilton," she said, her voice clear and steady. "This is the hollow schoolhouse. The children and I are weathered in. You are welcome to our shelter until the storm passes and you are well enough to travel." He continued to stare, his expression unreadable. His gaze flickered from her face to the rifle leaning against the wall, then back to her. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Finally, he spoke. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like stones shifting in a riverbed. It was a voice unused to speaking. "Silas," he said, just the one word. Alara's breath caught. It was the name she had given him. The coincidence was so startling it felt like a premonition, a sign that their fates were now irrevocably tangled. She simply nodded, unable to find her own voice for a moment. The man, Silas, leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes, a grimace of pain tightening his features. The brief exchange had clearly taken a toll. The initial tension in the room began to slowly recede, replaced by a new, uncertain quiet. He was awake. He had a name, but he was still a mystery, a massive, wounded piece of the wilderness that was now resting in the heart of her small, fragile world. The storm howled outside, and Alara had the distinct feeling that the real storm was only just beginning. The hours that followed unfolded in a strange, tense tableau. Silas did not speak again. He remained propped against the wall, a silent, brooding mountain of a man who seemed to be listening to something far beyond the walls of the schoolhouse. He would occasionally open his pale, watchful eyes to observe them, his gaze lingering on the children with an intensity that was neither menacing nor kind, but simply observant. It was the way a wolf might watch a herd of deer, not with immediate hunger, but with an ancient, ingrained understanding of their nature. Alara tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy for the children. She had them practice their letters on their slates, their soft scraping sounds unnaturally loud in the quiet room. She read to them from the Swiss Family Robinson, her voice a steady anchor in the sea of uncertainty. But her attention was constantly divided. A part of her was always aware of Silas, of the sheer physical presence of him. He dominated the small room without moving a muscle. Every shift of his weight, every shallow breath he took, was a momentous event. The fever she had feared began to take a firmer hold as the day wore on. A flush appeared high on his cheekbones, and his skin was hot to the touch. He drifted in and out of a restless, fevered sleep, muttering things she could not understand, fragments of words, names, curses that were bitten off before they could fully form. During these times, the intimidating hardness of his face would crumble, revealing a raw vulnerability that was more unsettling than his waking stillness. He looked like a man haunted by ghosts she could not see. She kept a cool, damp cloth on his forehead, changing it whenever it grew warm. He never acknowledged her touch, but he did not pull away. Once, as she leaned close to wipe the sweat from his temple, his eyes snapped open, clear and lucid for a moment. They were inches from hers. She froze, the cloth in her hand. The wildness was back in his gaze, but this time it was mixed with confusion. He stared at her as if he could not comprehend what she was, this small, determined woman tending to him as if he were one of her charges. Then his eyes clouded over again, and he slipped back into the fever's grip. The children, with their innate resilience, began to adapt to his presence. Their fears slowly gave way to a cautious curiosity. Jacob, the quietest of them all, would sit at a distance, pretending to read, but actually watching Silas with an unblinking stare. The Miller boys, after being shushed by Alara for the 10th time, seemed to regard him as a piece of interesting and slightly dangerous landscape. But it was Lily who broke the unspoken barrier. It happened late in the afternoon of that first full day. The storm had not abated. The world was a maelstrom of white. Lily had been playing with a small, faceless doll made of corn husks, a treasured possession. It slipped from her grasp and rolled across the floorboards, coming to a stop just beside Silas's outstretched hand. Lily stared at her doll, then at the giant. Her lower lip began to tremble. She looked at Alara, her eyes wide with a silent plea. Alara started to rise, to retrieve it for her, but a low groan from Silas stopped her. He was stirring again, his head moving back and forth against the wall. Before Alara could intervene, Lily seemed to make a decision. She crept forward, one slow, tentative step at a time, her gaze fixed on her doll. She was a tiny, brave mouse approaching a sleeping lion. She reached the doll, her small fingers snatching it up quickly. As she did, her hand brushed against Silas's. His eyes opened. They were fever-bright and unfocused, but they fixed on the little girl beside him. Lily froze, her hand still in the air, her face a mask of terror. She looked as if she was about to let out a scream that would shake the rafters. And then, the most extraordinary thing happened. The harsh lines of Silas's face softened. The grim set of his mouth relaxed. He blinked slowly, as if trying to clear his vision. He looked at the terrified child, and then his gaze dropped to the corn-husked doll clutched in her hand. He did not speak. He simply raised his own hand, the one that was not clenched around the hilt of his knife, and very gently, with a surprising delicacy in his large, calloused fingers, he tucked a stray piece of corn silk back into the doll's head. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, a moment of pivotal gentleness that shattered the intimidating facade he had built around himself. It was an act of nonverbal communication, a quiet signal that he was not a monster. He was not a threat to the child. Lily stared at his hand, then up at his face. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a look of profound wonder. She gave him a small, hesitant smile. Then she turned and scurried back to the safety of her sister, clutching her doll to her chest as if it were a holy relic. Alara sank back on her stool, her knees suddenly weak. She had been watching, holding her breath, ready to leap between them. But the danger she had perceived had been a phantom. The interaction had lasted no more than 10 seconds, but it had changed everything. It was a crack in the wall of her fear, letting in a sliver of light. This man, this wild creature from the storm, had a well of gentleness hidden deep within him. He was not the savage she had feared. He was something else entirely, something more complex, and perhaps even more dangerous to the careful defenses she had built around her own heart. After that moment, the atmosphere in the schoolhouse shifted. The tension did not disappear, but it changed its character. It was no longer the sharp-edged fear of a predator in the fold, but the quieter, more complex tension of a shared, uncertain predicament. Silas, for his part, seemed to sink deeper into the fever. He barely roused for the rest of the day and through the long, howling night. Alara tended to him dutifully, her earlier fear replaced by a growing sense of responsibility, and something else she could not name. A connection. She felt tied to this stranger, not just by circumstance, but by that single, gentle act. The third day dawned to a world of absolute, profound silence. The wind had finally died. Alara woke from a fitful doze on her stool to an unnatural stillness. She went to the window and scraped away a patch of frost. What she saw stole her breath. The world was remade. Every surface was buried under a thick, pristine blanket of snow, easily 5 feet deep in the drifts against the schoolhouse. The trees were magnificent, white-robed giants, their branches bowed low under the immense weight. The sky above was a brilliant cloudless blue, and the sun, glinting off the endless expanse of white, was blinding. The storm was over, but they were not free. They were entombed. A low cough brought her attention back to the room. Silas was awake, and this time his eyes were clear. The fever had broken. He was watching her, his expression still wary, but the frantic, panicked edge was gone. "The storm has passed," she said, stating the obvious. He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the window. "Aye," he rumbled. He pushed himself up straighter against the wall, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitched wound. "How long?" "This is the third day," she replied. She moved to the stove, busying herself with making a thin broth. "You had a fever. It broke last night." He touched the bandage on his head, his fingers exploring the edges. "You did this." "I did," she said, not looking at him. The wound needed closing. He was silent for a long moment. She could feel his eyes on her as she worked. "My thanks," he said finally, the words sounding rusty, as if he had to drag them up from a deep and used well. She brought him a cup of the broth. He took it from her, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. His hand was rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly careful. He drank the broth slowly, gratefully, like a man who had not tasted food in a long time. The children were still sleeping, a tangle of limbs under the blankets. The schoolhouse was quiet, filled only with the soft crackle of the fire and the sound of Silas drinking his broth. It felt strangely domestic, dangerously so. Later that day, when the children were awake and the precarious rhythm of their confinement had been re-established, the silence between Alara and Silas finally broke. It was not a sudden flood of conversation, but a slow, hesitant exchange, like two people learning a foreign language. "What happened to you?" she asked, her voice quiet. She was mending a tear in one of the Miller boys' coats, her needle moving in and out of the thick wool. Silas had been staring into the fire, his big hands resting on his knees. He seemed to consider the question for a long time before answering. "Grizzly," he said, "a young one," surprised it near its kill. "It was him or me." He gestured vaguely toward the door. "My rifle is out there, buried." The matter-of-fact way he spoke of a life-and-death struggle with one of the most feared creatures in the mountains sent a chill through her. He spoke of it as if it were a common inconvenience, like a broken wagon wheel. "You live out here? Alone?" she asked. He gave a short, sharp nod. "Higher up, near the pass." That was the most unforgiving territory on the entire range, a place where only the hardiest or most desperate would dare to make a home. Why? The question was out before she could stop it. It was too personal, too prying. He turned his head and looked at her, his pale gray eyes seeming to see right through her defenses. He did not seem offended. He simply looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than watchfulness in his expression. It was a deep, profound sadness, a loneliness that mirrored her own. "Some men are not made for towns," he said, his voice a low rumble. And that seemed to be all the explanation he was willing to give. She did not press. Instead, she found herself telling him about Thomas, about his illness, about their dream of building this school. She spoke of the hollow folk, of the children, of her fierce desire to give them a chance at something more than a life of back-breaking labor in the mines or on the Scrabble farms. She did not know why she was telling him this. Perhaps it was the isolation, the shared experience of the storm. Or perhaps it was the memory of his gentle hand on Lily's doll. She felt, inexplicably, that he would understand. Then, emboldened by his quiet listening, she told him about the debt. She told him about Mr. Barrett. As she spoke his name, she saw a flicker of something in Silas's eyes. A cold, hard light. She told him about the letters, about the final, vile proposal. She did not mean to let her voice tremble, but it did. She did not mean for a single tear to escape and trace a hot path down her cheek, but it did. She wiped it away angrily. "He thinks because I am a woman alone, I am his for the taking," she said, her voice thick with a bitterness she rarely allowed herself to show. "He thinks his money gives him the right to own anything, to own anyone." Silas had gone very still. His hands, which had been resting on his knees, were now clenched into fists, the knuckles white. He was no longer looking at the fire. He was looking at her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before. It was not pity. It was a cold, quiet fury. It was the look of a protector who has just identified a threat. "This man," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Barrett. He is in Blackwood Gulch." "Yes," she whispered. He nodded slowly, a single, deliberate movement. "The snow will hold him for a time. But men like that, they are patient hunters." The way he said it sent a fresh wave of fear through her. But this time, it was different. It was not the lonely, desperate fear she had lived with for months. It was a shared fear. And looking at the grim, resolute expression on the mountain man's face, she realized with a startling certainty that she was no longer facing it alone. The storm had passed, but it had left behind something far more powerful in its wake. An ally. A wounded, wild, and dangerous ally. The days that followed the storm were a strange interlude, a pocket of time that existed outside the normal flow of life. The world was a vast, silent expanse of white, beautiful and deadly in its isolation. The schoolhouse was their entire universe, a wooden ark adrift on a frozen sea. There was no way out. The snow was a wall, sealing them in, and for the first time, Alara was grateful for it. It was a barrier not only against the wilderness, but against Alistair Barrett and the world of men. A new rhythm established itself within the small building. It was a rhythm of shared survival. In the mornings, Alara would teach the children, her voice soft in the quiet air as she guided them through arithmetic and spelling. Silas would sit by the fire, sharpening his formidable knife with a whetstone he produced from a pouch on his belt, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel a strangely comforting sound. He never interrupted, but she often caught him listening, a thoughtful, unreadable expression on his face. His strength returned with astonishing speed. The man was hewn from the same resilient granite as the mountains themselves. By the second day after the fever broke, he was moving about the cabin, his earlier stiffness replaced by a slow, deliberate grace that was mesmerizing to watch. He was a man utterly at home in his own body, a creature of immense physical power that he held in careful check. He took over the task of chopping wood. Alara's small woodshed, built into the leeward side of the school, was nearly buried, but Silas, using a shovel he fashioned from a broken floorboard and his own raw strength, dug a tunnel to it. He would spend an hour each afternoon in the biting cold, his breath pluming in the air, the steady, powerful thump of the axe echoing in the silent hollow. He worked with an economy of motion, each swing of the axe a perfect, brutal arc that split the frozen logs with terrifying efficiency. The Miller boys would watch him from the window, their faces pressed to the glass, their eyes wide with hero worship. These scenes of domestic bonding became the fabric of their days. They were small, quiet moments that wove a thread of connection between the wary teacher and the wild mountain man. He showed Jacob how to tie a series of intricate knots, his large, scarred fingers moving with surprising dexterity as he guided the boy's smaller ones. He listened, his head cocked to one side, as Sarah read a passage from a book, and when she stumbled over a word, he supplied it in his low rumble, startling them all. He ate the simple meals Alara prepared, thin stews and hard biscuits, with a quiet gratitude that made her feel as if she were serving him a feast. He rarely spoke of himself, but he watched her, and he listened. One evening, as the children slept and the two of them sat in the companionable silence that had grown between them, he finally offered a piece of his past. It was not a story, but a scar. He was mending a tear in his bearskin cloak, using a thick needle and a strand of sinew. Alara was watching his hands, the way they moved with such practiced skill. "The one on your face," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Was that the bear, too?" He paused in his work, his hands going still. He raised a hand and touched the old, silvered scar at his temple. "No," he said, his voice flat. "That was a man. A long time ago." He did not elaborate, but the bleakness that entered his eyes was a story in itself. It spoke of betrayal, of a life he had left behind, of a wound that went far deeper than the flesh. She felt a sudden, fierce urge to understand that wound, to know the man he had been before the mountains had claimed him. "What was your life like?" she asked softly. "Before the pass." He looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face. He seemed to be weighing her, deciding what she was capable of understanding. "I had a family," he said at last, the words rough, as if they pained his throat. "A wife, a daughter, on a homestead down in the flatlands." He looked away, back toward the fire, but she could see the muscles in his jaw working. "There was a land dispute, with a man like your Barrett, a man who believed the law was whatever his money could buy." He fell silent. The fire crackled, spitting embers onto the hearth. Alara waited, her heart aching with a sudden, terrible premonition. "They came at night," he continued, his voice so low it was almost lost in the sound of the fire. "Said they were lawmen, serving a writ. It was a lie. They were hired guns. I was away, trading for supplies. When I got back..." He stopped. He did not need to finish the sentence. The raw, desolate emptiness in his voice painted a picture more horrifying than any words could. The smoke, the silence, the discovery. "I hunted them," he said, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The voice was no longer that of a quiet homesteader. It was the voice of an avenging angel, cold and absolute. "All of them. The one who gave the order, I found him in a fancy house in St. Louis. He died thinking a ghost had come for him." He looked at his hands, as if seeing them for the first time. "After that, there was no place for me in the world of men. So I came here, where the only law is the mountain." Tears were streaming down Alara's face, silent tears of shared grief, of understanding. Her own loss, as painful as it was, felt small and pale next to the scorched earth devastation of his. She understood now. The solitude, the watchfulness, the carefully controlled violence that seemed to simmer just beneath his skin. He was not just an outcast. He was a man who had burned down his own world to avenge the one he had lost. She reached out, her hand covering one of his. His skin was rough, but a current of warmth passed between them. He flinched at her touch, a barely perceptible tremor, but he did not pull away. He simply sat there, his hand under hers, staring into the flames as he relived a nightmare a decade old. In that moment, by the fireside in a snow-locked schoolhouse, two broken people, a grieving widow and a haunted killer, found a moment of profound and silent communion. The trust between them was no longer a fragile thread. It was a bond forged in the crucible of shared pain. A week after the storm, the world began to thaw. The sun, which had been a distant, cold diamond, regained some of its strength. The snow began to melt, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. The pristine white landscape became streaked with the dark, wet earth. The sound of dripping water was constant, a ticking clock counting down the seconds of their isolation. With the thaw came the return of dread. The first sign of the outside world came in the form of a man named Jedediah, an old, grizzled trapper who worked a line of snares in the lower woods. He appeared one afternoon, his mule struggling through the slushy, half-melted drifts. He was a friend, one of the few people who looked out for Alara. He brought a small sack of flour and some dried apples, his face etched with worry. "Heard you and the young uns were holed up," he said, his eyes flicking nervously toward Silas, who stood silently by the door, a towering, intimidating sentinel. "Figured you might be low on victuals." "We are well, Jedediah." "Thank you," Alara said, her gratitude genuine. "This is Silas." He was caught in the storm as well. Jedediah gave Silas a wary nod, clearly unnerved by his size and the fierce, untamed look of him. "Saw your light from the ridge," he said, turning his attention back to Alara, his voice dropping. "Came to give you a warning, Mrs. There's talk in Blackwood Gulch." "Bad talk." Alara's stomach went cold. "What kind of talk?" "Barrett," the old trapper said, the name a curse on his lips. "He has been telling anyone who will listen that you absconded with a great sum of his money before your husband passed. Says he holds the deed to this land free and clear. He has put together a posse. Not official law, just a pack of hard men from the saloon he keeps on his payroll. He was aiming to come up before the storm hit. The snow held him off, but he is getting impatient. The lower trail is almost clear. They will be coming, Alara. Soon." The old trapper's words hung in the air like smoke. He left soon after, refusing to stay, his nervousness around Silas palpable. When he was gone, the schoolhouse felt smaller, the walls closing in. The sanctuary had become a target. "He will not come alone," Silas said, his voice a flat statement of fact. He was looking out the window, his gaze fixed on the muddy trail leading down the mountain. "What can we do?" Alara whispered, the old helplessness clawing at her. "We cannot run. The snow is still too deep in the high passes. We are trapped." "We do not run," Silas said, turning from the window. The cold fury she had seen once before was back in his eyes, honed to a razor's edge. "We make our stand. Here." Thus began the fortification of the schoolhouse. The quiet domesticity of the past week vanished, replaced by a tense, urgent purpose. Silas was no longer a quiet guest. He was a commander preparing for a siege. His knowledge of survival, of combat, was terrifying in its completeness. "The door is weak," he stated, running a hand over the thick planks. "They will come through it first. We need to brace it." He and the Miller boys, their eyes shining with a mixture of fear and excitement, dragged the heaviest of the desks and wedged it against the door, creating a crude but effective barricade. "The windows are a problem," he continued, striding the length of the room. "Too large. They give a clear field of fire." He had Alara and Sarah nail blankets over the lower half of the two windows, leaving only a narrow slit at the top to see and shoot through. The room was plunged into a gloomy twilight, even in the middle of the day. The schoolhouse was transformed from a place of learning into a makeshift fortress. The air grew thick with the tension of impending violence. The children were quiet, their games forgotten. They watched Silas, their small faces pale, understanding that the game had become real. That evening, Silas retrieved the rifle from where it had leaned against the wall. It was Thomas's old Winchester, a gun Alara had never touched except to clean. He held it in his hands, his movements sure and familiar. He checked the action, the barrel, his expression grim. "Do you know how to use this?" he asked her, his voice leaving no room for evasion. "No," she admitted, her voice small. "Thomas tried to show me once. I did not like it." "There is no room for like now," he said, his tone hard but not unkind. "There is only survival. You need to know, I cannot be everywhere at once." And so, in the dying light of the afternoon, the mountain man began to train the teacher in the art of killing. He handed her the rifle. It was heavier than she remembered, cold and brutally functional. He showed her how to hold it, how to brace it against her shoulder. He made her sight down the barrel at a knot in the far wall, correcting her stance, moving her hands until they were just right. His touch was impersonal, focused, the touch of a master craftsman teaching an apprentice. "You do not jerk the trigger," he instructed, his low voice in her ear. "You squeeze it, slow and steady, like you're squeezing the last drop of water from a cloth. Hold your breath when you fire. Let it out after." He had a handful of cartridges, precious and few. He could not spare any for practice shots. Her training would be theoretical until the moment it became terrifyingly real. He had her practice loading, firing the empty rifle, working the lever action until the movements became less clumsy, more ingrained. She hated it. She hated the feel of the cold steel, the violent click of the mechanism, the way it represented a world of brutality she had spent her life trying to avoid. But as she practiced, a grim resolve began to settle in her heart. She thought of Barrett's leering face. She thought of the children, huddled in the corner, their safety dependent on her and this strange, violent man. Her hands grew steady. Her movements became sure. The fear did not leave, but it was joined by something new, a cold, hard determination. She would not be a victim. She would not be a prize to be claimed. If they came for her, they would find she was not the gentle, helpless woman they expected. The mountain had taught her its first lesson. To survive, sometimes you had to become as hard as the stone itself. The weight was the worst part. Every sound, the drip of melting snow from the eaves, the caw of a distant crow, the scuttling of a mouse in the walls, was a potential threat. The tense quiet stretched for 2 days after Jedediah's warning. The world outside was slowly, inexorably, opening up. The muddy track that served as a road was becoming passable. Alara felt as if a noose was slowly tightening around their small sanctuary. During this time, Silas was a specter of watchful readiness. He barely slept, catnapping in a chair by the barricaded door, his hand never far from the hilt of his knife or the rifle that leaned beside him. He had taken Thomas's old hunting rifle for himself, leaving Alara with the smaller, lighter carbine she had been practicing with. He had also given her Thomas's revolver, a heavy Colt, showing her how to load its 6 chambers. "This is for close work," he had said, his voice grim. "If they get inside." The words sent a fresh spike of terror through her, but she had taken the weapon, its weight a dense, cold promise of violence. The children were a constant, heart-wrenching presence. She tried to keep them occupied, to shield them from the suffocating tension, but they knew. They saw the barricades, the weapons, the grim set of Silas's jaw. They were quiet and subdued, moving about the darkened schoolroom like little ghosts. Lily, in a moment that broke Alara's heart, came to her and pressed the corn-husk doll into her hand. "For luck," the little girl had whispered, her eyes huge and dark with a fear she did not have the words to express. Alara clutched the simple toy as if it were a holy talisman, a reminder of what, and who, she was fighting for. The attack came in the late afternoon of the 3rd day. The light was beginning to fade, casting long, deep shadows that bled from the edges of the forest. Silas, who had been standing at one of the narrow window slits for the better part of an hour, suddenly went rigid. "They are here," he said, his voice a low, flat rumble that cut through the quiet room. Alera's blood ran cold. She hurried to his side, peering through the slit. In the distance, where the trail emerged from the trees, she saw them. A group of riders, dark silhouettes against the graying sky. There were 6 of them, 5 men, their shapes rough and indistinct, and one who sat his horse with an air of arrogant authority she would have recognized anywhere. Alistair Barrett. "Get the children to the back," Silas ordered, his voice sharp, pulling her from her horrified trance. "Keep them low, away from the windows." Alera obeyed instantly, her body moving with a rehearsed efficiency she didn't know she possessed. She gathered the frightened children, herding them to the small pantry at the rear of the schoolhouse. "Stay in here," she commanded, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "Do not come out, no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" They nodded, their small faces pale and terrified. She closed the pantry door, plunging them into darkness, a necessary cruelty to keep them safe. When she returned to the main room, rifle in hand, the riders were much closer. They had fanned out, forming a loose semicircle around the schoolhouse, just beyond what she guessed was effective pistol range. Barrett sat in the center, a stout, imposing figure on a fine black horse, a stark contrast to the rough-looking men who flanked him. "Alera Hamilton." Barrett's voice boomed across the clearing, slick with a false civility that made her skin crawl. "You are in possession of stolen property, and you are harboring a known fugitive. The man with you is Silas Kane, a murderer with a price on his head. Send him out, and come out yourself, and I will see that the law is lenient with you." Alera glanced at Silas. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes, when they met hers, held a flicker of something she could not read. Kane. So that was his last name. A murderer. The news should have terrified her, but it didn't. She had heard his story. She knew the truth of his murder. It only solidified her resolve. They were 2 outcasts against the world. "He is lying," Silas said, his voice low. "About the bounty. It was a long time ago. He's trying to scare you." "I'm not scared," she said, and was surprised to find it was true. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overlaid with a white-hot anger. "This is your last chance, Alera," Barrett shouted, his voice losing its polished edge, revealing the raw impatience beneath. "Do not make me damage my own property." Silas raised his rifle, resting the barrel on the edge of the window slit. He did not answer Barrett's call. He waited. The silence stretched, taut and vibrating. One of the riders, a big, bearded man, grew impatient. He spurred his horse forward a few paces, raising his own rifle. "Let's just smoke him out, boss," he yelled. It was the last thing he ever said. The report of Silas's rifle was a deafening crack that echoed off the mountainside. It was not a wild shot. It was a single, deliberate, and terrifyingly precise act. The impatient rider was thrown from his saddle as if struck by a giant, invisible fist, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. He hit the muddy ground and did not move. Chaos erupted. The other riders yelled, fumbling for their own weapons. A pistol shot rang out, the bullet thudding harmlessly into the log wall high above the window. The siege had begun. The next minutes were a blur of noise, smoke, and terror. Silas moved with the savage grace of a cornered grizzly. He was no longer the quiet, brooding man who mended cloaks and carved knots. He was a whirlwind of lethal efficiency. He fired the rifle, worked the lever, and fired again, his movements a fluid, economical dance of death. A second rider clutched at his shoulder, his horse rearing in panic and bolting back into the trees. The other side, Silas barked at her, not taking his eyes from his targets. "Watch the other window." Alera scrambled to the second window slit, her heart hammering. 2 of the men had dismounted and were using the trees for cover, trying to circle around to the less defended side of the building. She rested her carbine on the sill, her hands slick with sweat. She could see one of them, a lean man in a dusty coat, darting from one pine to the next, getting closer. She remembered Silas's words. "Squeeze, don't jerk. Hold your breath." She raised the rifle, the iron sights wavering. She lined them up with the man's chest as he broke cover, running for the blind spot beneath the window. She held her breath. She squeezed the trigger. The carbine bucked against her shoulder, the sound shockingly loud in her ears. The man stumbled, cried out, and fell, clutching his leg. He was not dead, but he was down. He screamed in pain and fury, trying to drag himself back to the cover of the trees. A wave of nausea and a strange, terrifying exhilaration washed over her. She had shot a man. She, Elara Hamilton, the gentle schoolteacher, had put a bullet in another human being. But there was no time for reflection. The other henchman on her side began firing wildly, his pistol shots splintering the wood around the window, sending shards of wood flying into the room. Suddenly, a tremendous crash came from the front of the schoolhouse. They were using a log as a battering ram against the door. The heavy planks shuddered, the wood groaning in protest. The barricade of desks scraped against the floor, but held. Crash! A crack appeared in the door. "They're coming through," Silas yelled, leaving his window and moving to the center of the room, pulling his heavy knife from its sheath. His rifle was empty. He had fired all his rounds. Crash! The door splintered, bursting inward. The desk barricade was thrown aside. Two men spilled into the room, pistols drawn, their faces grim in the smoky twilight. Behind them, in the ruined doorway, stood Barrett, his face a mask of triumphant fury. The first man raised his pistol toward Silas. Before he could fire, the report of Alara's carbine filled the room again. She hadn't had time to think, only to react. The man grunted, his eyes wide with surprise, and collapsed. Now it was pandemonium. The second man fired, his shot going wild and shattering the last intact lantern, plunging the room into deeper gloom. Silas was on him in two long strides. It was not a fight. It was an execution. There was a blur of motion, the flash of steel. The man made a choked, gurgling sound and fell, the hilt of Silas's knife protruding from his chest. It was over in seconds. The room was suddenly silent, save for the ragged sound of their breathing and the whimpering of the wounded man outside. Two bodies lay on the floor. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. And then there was only Barrett. He stood in the doorway, his own pistol in his hand, his face pale, his bravado gone, replaced by a mixture of shock and rage. He had expected a terrified woman and a single man. He had not expected this. He had not expected a fortress defended by a demon and a lioness. His eyes fixed on Alara, his expression curdling into one of pure, venomous hatred. He had been defied. He had been beaten. His hired thugs lay dead or dying at the hands of a woman he had considered his property. His wounded pride was more dangerous than his greed. "You," he hissed, his voice trembling with fury. "You worthless bitch. I will kill him, and then I will teach you the meaning of respect." He raised his pistol, but he did not aim at Silas, who was pulling his knife from the dead man's chest, a terrifying figure of vengeance. He aimed it at Alara. Tom seemed to slow down. She saw the dark, round hole of the pistol's muzzle. She saw the hate in his eyes. She was still holding the carbine, but it was empty. Her hand went to her waist, to the heavy Colt revolver Silas had given her. It felt impossibly heavy, impossibly slow. But before Barrett could fire, a new sound entered the fray. A high, terrified scream from the back of the schoolhouse. The pantry door flew open, and Lily, her face streaked with tears, ran out. "Miss Hamilton!" The child's sudden appearance was a fatal distraction. Barrett's eyes flickered toward the girl. It was only for a second, but it was enough. Silas moved. He was a blur of dark motion, a predator closing the distance. He did not run. He launched himself across the room. He hit Barrett with the force of a battering ram, his shoulder colliding with the stout man's chest. The pistol went off, the shot firing harmlessly into the ceiling as both men crashed backward through the ruined doorway and out into the mud and snow. Alara screamed his name, Silas, and ran to the door, her heart seizing with terror. The two men were grappling in the mud, a chaotic tangle of limbs. Barrett, though a physical coward, was a large man, and he was fighting with the desperation of the cornered. He still had his pistol, trying to bring it to bear on Silas, who had one hand on the man's wrist, forcing the gun away, while his other hand sought to purchase a hold. Alara raised the Colt, her hands shaking violently. She could not get a clear shot. They were too close, moving too fast. She might hit Silas. Barrett, using his weight, managed to roll on top of Silas, pressing him down into the slush. He grunted with effort, forcing the pistol down towards Silas's face. Silas's arm was shaking with the strain of holding it off. His face was a mask of grim effort, his muscles corded. He was losing. "I own you," Barrett snarled, his face inches from Silas's. "I own this mountain. I own her." That was his mistake. As he snarled the words, his gaze shifted for a fraction of a second to Alara, who stood in the doorway, a figure of horrified paralysis. In that moment of distraction, Silas, with a final, explosive surge of strength, twisted his body. He was not trying to escape. He was using Barrett's own weight and momentum against him. He bucked and rolled, and suddenly they were tumbling toward the edge of the small, cleared plateau where the schoolhouse stood. The ground here dropped away sharply, a steep, tree-studded slope that fell away into the dark hollow below. "No!" Alara screamed, seeing his intent. They went over the edge together, a single, struggling mass of humanity. They disappeared from her sight. She heard a crash of breaking branches, a single, sharp cry of terror from Barrett, and then a sickening, final thud from far below. And then silence. A silence more profound and terrifying than all the noise that had come before. Alara stood frozen in the doorway, the heavy revolver still in her hand. The scene was a tableau of carnage. The ruined door, the dead men on her floor, the whimpering of the wounded man in the trees, the terrified crying of Lily, who had been scooped up by Sarah and pulled back into the relative safety of the schoolroom. And outside, the empty, muddy clearing and the terrible, silent cliff edge. He was gone. Silas was gone. He had saved her. He had saved them all, and he had paid for it with his life. The thought was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. A wave of grief so immense, so devastating, it dwarfed everything she had ever felt before, washed over her. She sank to her knees in the ruined doorway, the Colt falling from her numb fingers, and she let out a single, ragged sob that was torn from the very depths of her soul. The silence that followed the battle was a living thing, thick and suffocating. It was broken only by the low, piteous moans of the man Alara had shot in the leg and the muffled sobs of the children huddled inside the pantry. For a long time, Alara could not move. She remained on her knees in the doorway, staring at the spot where Silas and Barrett had vanished over the edge. The cold mud soaked through her dress, but she did not feel it. The world had gone gray and silent, the sounds muted, the colors leached away. Grief was a hollow, ringing emptiness in her chest. It was Jacob's small hand on her shoulder that finally broke the spell. "Miss Hamilton," he said, his voice small but steady. Are they all gone?" She looked at him, then at the other children peering out from behind him, their faces pale and tear-streaked. Sarah held a trembling Lily, whose face was buried in her older sister's dress. The Miller boys stood behind them, their earlier excitement replaced by a sober, wide-eyed shock. They were looking to her. They needed her. The realization was a splash of icy water. She could not fall apart. Not now. She took a deep, shuddering breath and pushed herself to her feet. Her legs were unsteady, but she forced them to hold her. "Yes," she said, her voice hoarse. "They are gone. The danger is past." She looked at the bodies on the floor, at the destruction of her schoolhouse. "We are safe." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Her first duty was to the living. The man outside was still moaning. Leaving him to die was not an option, not even after what he had tried to do. And leaving him armed was an even greater risk. "Stay inside," she told the children, her voice taking on a new, hard authority she had not known it possessed. She picked up the heavy Colt revolver, its weight a grim reality in her hand, and stepped out into the clearing. The wounded man, the lean one she had shot, had managed to drag himself to the base of a large pine. His face was slick with sweat and contorted in pain. His pistol lay in the mud a few feet from his outstretched hand. He watched her approach, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hate. Alara kicked his pistol away, sending it skittering across the clearing. She stood over him, the revolver held steady in her hand. The woman who had been terrified of firearms just days ago was gone. In her place was someone else, someone forged in the violence of the last hour. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice cold. "Name's Cole," he grunted, clutching his bleeding leg. "Barrett paid us. Said it was a simple collection. Your friends are dead," she said flatly. "Barrett is dead. You have a choice. You can lie here and bleed to death or die of the cold tonight. Or you can get on your horse, ride down to Blackwood Gulch, and tell the sheriff exactly what happened here. Tell him Barrett brought armed men to attack a schoolteacher and her students. Tell him it was self-defense. If you do that, I will bind your leg and let you go. If you ever come back to this mountain, I will not wound you. I will kill you. Do you understand me?" The man stared at her, at the absolute certainty in her eyes, at the unwavering barrel of the gun in her hand. He saw no mercy, only a grim bargain. He nodded, his face pale. "I understand." She kept the gun on him as she retrieved one of the linen bandages from inside. She tore a strip from her own petticoat to make a tourniquet, tightening it above the wound with a stick until the bleeding slowed. Then she wrapped the bandage tightly around his thigh. It was crude, but it would hold. "Go," she said, stepping back. "Now." He dragged himself to his horse, which stood grazing nervously nearby. It took him several agonizing attempts, but he finally managed to haul his body into the saddle. He gave her one last look, a look of grudging respect and profound fear, then turned his horse and rode away, a hunched, pathetic figure disappearing into the twilight. The last of Barrett's posse was gone. Now there was only the silence and the dead, and the gaping wound in her heart where Silas had been. She could not bring herself to go to the edge of the cliff. Not yet. To look down would be to confirm the terrible finality of it. Instead, she turned her attention to the grim task at hand. The children could not stay here, not with the bodies. With a strength she did not know she possessed, she dragged the two dead henchmen out of the schoolhouse and into the muddy clearing, covering them with a spare tarp from the woodshed. She could not look at their faces. They were simply objects now, the terrible cost of her survival. She spent the next hour cleaning. She scrubbed the blood from the floorboards until her hands were raw. She swept up the shattered glass from the lantern, the splinters of wood from the door. She worked with a frantic, desperate energy, trying to erase the violence, to reclaim her space. But the room would never be the same. It was haunted now by the smell of gunpowder that lingered in the air, by the memory of the brutal, life-altering struggle it had witnessed. When the worst of it was done, she gathered the children. "We cannot stay here tonight," she said, her voice softer now. "We will go to the Gables cabin. It is the closest." They packed what little they could. The remaining food, blankets, the children's precious few books. As she was gathering their things, Alara's hand closed around the corn husk doll Lily had given her. She clutched it tightly, its simple form a link to the innocence that had been so brutally shattered. The journey through the darkening woods was a nightmare. The half-mile to the Gables homestead felt like 100. Every shadow was a threat, every snap of a twig a fresh terror. Alara led the way, the carbine in one hand and a lantern in the other, the children trailing behind her like a line of ducklings. When the flickering light of the Gables cabin appeared through the trees, a wave of relief so powerful it made her dizzy washed over her. Mr. Gable, a stern, hard-working man, met them at the door, his face a mask of alarm at the sight of the ragged, terrified procession. The story came out in a torrent, told by Alara in stark, clipped sentences punctuated by the wide-eyed testimony of his own daughters. Mr. Gable listened, his expression growing grimmer with each word. When she was finished, he simply nodded. "You did what you had to, ma'am," he said, his voice filled with a quiet respect she had never heard from him before. "You and the children are safe here." His wife, a kind, careworn woman bustled the children inside, clucking over them, wrapping them in warm blankets, and pressing mugs of hot milk into their hands. They were safe. The immediate threat was gone. But as Alara stood on the Gables' porch, watching the last of the light fade from the sky, a new choice, a new crossroads, presented itself. She was free. Barrett was gone, the debt erased by his death. The men who had terrorized her were dead or fled. She had won, but the victory felt hollow, bitter. The man who had made it possible, the man who had shown her a strength she never knew she possessed, was lying broken at the bottom of a ravine. He had come into her life like a storm, and he had departed just as violently, leaving behind a wake of destruction and a silence that was more painful than any sound. She had a future now. She could rebuild the school. She could continue her work. But the thought of that future, a future without the quiet, watchful presence of the mountain man, was a bleak and empty prospect. He had believed he had no place in the world of men. He had seen himself as a solitary creature of the wilderness. But in the space of one short week, he had carved out a place in the heart of her small, fragile world. He had become its protector, its center, and now he was gone. The loner had fulfilled his duty, and the cost had been everything. The peace she had won felt like a different kind of prison. Alara did not sleep. She sat in a rocking chair by the Gables' hearth, the borrowed blanket around her shoulders doing little to ward off the chill that had settled deep in her bones. The Gable children were asleep with their parents, and her own charges were curled up together in the loft, finally succumbing to their emotional and physical exhaustion. The house was quiet, but for Alara, the silence was filled with the echoes of the day's violence and the crushing weight of Silas's absence. She stared into the fire, her mind replaying the final, terrible moments. The struggle in the mud, Barrett's hateful words, the desperate, selfless act that had sent both men over the edge. Silas had not hesitated. He had seen the threat to her, to the child, and he had chosen to eliminate it, even though it meant his own certain death. He had thrown himself into the abyss to save them. The grief was a physical thing, a heavy stone in her chest. But as the night wore on, another feeling began to surface, pushing through the thick layers of sorrow. It was a tiny, insistent flicker of something. Not hope. It was too fragile for that. It was a question, a sliver of doubt. She had heard a thud, a final, sickening sound, but she had not seen him land. She had not seen his body. She had assumed the fall was fatal, because for any normal man, it would have been. But Silas was not a normal man. He was a man who survived grisly attacks, a man carved from the mountain itself. Was it possible? Could he have survived a fall that would have killed anyone else? The thought was madness, a desperate fantasy born of grief. But it took root in her mind and began to grow. By the time the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the cabin window, the sliver of doubt had become a burning, desperate need. She had to know. She could not live the rest of her life wondering. She had to go back. She rose from the chair, her movements stiff. She found Mr. Gable in the barn, preparing for the morning chores. He looked at her, his expression weary but kind. "I have to go back," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. "To the schoolhouse." "Ma'am, there is nothing for you there now," he said gently. "The children are safe. You are safe. Let the sheriff handle the rest when he comes up." Cole, the wounded henchman, had apparently been true to his word, as a rider from a neighboring homestead had passed by late the previous night with news that the man had reached town and was telling his story. "It is not for the sheriff," she said, her gaze unwavering. "It is for me. I have to find him." Mr. Gable studied her face for a long moment, seeing the iron resolve there. He saw that this was not a request. He sighed, a plume of white in the cold morning air. "You cannot go alone," he said. "I will come with you." An hour later, they were making their way back up the muddy track. The morning was cold and bright, the air clean and sharp. The beauty of the day was a cruel mockery of the grim task ahead. When they reached the clearing, the scene was just as she had left it, a place of violation and death. The tarp-covered shapes in the mud were a stark reminder of the battle. Alara did not pause. She walked directly to the edge of the slope where they had gone over. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She took a deep breath and looked down. Section. The slope was steep, a treacherous tangle of rocks, fallen logs, and hardy brush. About 20 feet down, a large, thick pine grew at a sharp angle from the hillside, its branches shattered and broken. Below that, another 30 feet down, at the bottom of the ravine, lay a still, dark shape. It was Barrett. He had clearly hit the tree on his way down and then fallen the rest of the way, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. There was no doubt he was dead. But of Silas, there was no sign. "He is not there," she whispered, a wild, frantic hope surging through her. Mr. Gable came to stand beside her, his face grim as he looked down at Barrett's body. "The tree," he said, pointing, "looks like it broke their fall. Maybe only one of them went all the way down." Alara's eyes scanned the area around the broken pine. She saw it then. A trail. Not a clear one, but a definite sign of passage. A smear of mud on a rock here. A broken sapling there. Someone had dragged themselves away from the tree, moving laterally along the steep hillside rather than continuing down into the ravine. "He is alive," she breathed the word of prayer. "He is alive, and he is hurt." Without another thought, she started down the slope, half sliding, half climbing, grabbing onto roots and rocks for purchase. "Miss Hamilton, wait." Mr. Gable called after her, but she did not listen. She followed the faint trail, her eyes sharp, her mind focused on this single purpose. The tracks were difficult to follow, a testament to the agony of the man who had made them. There were spots of blood on the dead leaves, dark and stark. He was wounded, perhaps badly, but he was moving. He was fighting. The trail led her for nearly a quarter of a mile along the side of the ravine before it turned upward, back toward the higher ground. It was a trail of pure, stubborn will. She followed it into a thick stand of old-growth firs, the air growing cool and dark under their dense canopy. And there, leaning against the massive trunk of a fallen giant, she found him. He was sitting on the ground, his back against the log. His face was pale and streaked with dirt and blood. His left arm was held at an awkward angle, and his leg was clearly broken, the bone having torn through his buckskin trousers in a gruesome compound fracture. He was a wreck, a man broken and battered. But he was alive. His head was down, his chin on his chest, and for a terrifying moment she thought she was too late. But then he stirred, his head lifting slowly. His pale gray eyes found her. They were clouded with pain, but they were lucid. A flicker of surprise, of disbelief, crossed his face. "Alara," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. She ran the last few feet and fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch, afraid to cause him more pain. Tears she had refused to shed now streamed freely down her face. "I thought you were dead," she sobbed. "I thought you were gone." A faint, grim smile touched his lips. "The mountain is not done with me yet," he said, his voice weak. He looked at his shattered leg. "But it came close this time." "We have to get you back," she said, her mind racing. "Mr. Gable is here. We can make a litter." "No," he said, his voice firm despite its weakness. He tried to push himself up, a grimace of agony contorting his features. "I cannot go back there. To the settlement. I am what he said I was. A killer. There is no place for me." His words were a recitation of his old, solitary creed. His duty was done. He had protected her. Now he would retreat, to heal or to die, but to do it alone, as he always had. He was preparing to leave, to push her away, to return to the isolation that had been his life for so long. Alara looked at him, at this magnificent, broken man so determined to remain an outcast. She saw the pain in his eyes, a pain that went deeper than his shattered bones. It was the pain of a man who believed he was unworthy of comfort, of home, of love. And in that moment, her own transformation was complete. The fearful, pleading woman was gone forever. In her place was a woman who knew what she wanted, and who would fight for it with all the strength she now possessed. She reached out and took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. Her touch was gentle but firm. "Listen to me, Silas Kane," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing with an authority that surprised them both. "You are wrong. Your place is not up here, alone in the cold. Your place is with me." He stared at her, his pain-filled eyes wide with shock. "You think you do not belong?" she continued, her voice fierce with emotion. "You belong with the children who watch you with awe. You belong with the boy you taught to tie knots, and the girl whose doll you so gently mended. You belong in the schoolhouse you defended, in the home you helped to save. You are not just a killer, Silas. You are a protector. You are a hero. And you are the man I love." The words hung in the quiet forest air between them. It was a truth so new and so powerful, it took her own breath away. But it was the truest thing she had ever said. "I will not let you go back to your solitude," she declared, her thumbs stroking his dirt-streaked cheeks. "I will not let you hide from the world, or from me. Your fight is over. It is time to come home. Let me bring you home, Silas. Please." Her plea was not one of weakness, but of strength. It was a promise, a commitment. She was offering him not just shelter, but a future, a life, a family. Silas looked into her eyes, and in their clear, determined depths, he saw a future he had long ago given up on. He saw warmth and light, and a love he never believed he would know again. He saw home, the solitary code that had governed his life for a decade. The creed of the lonely hunter began to crumble. The pull of this woman, of the life she was offering, was stronger than the pull of the wilderness. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He leaned his head forward, resting his forehead against hers. A long, shuddering breath escaped him, the breath of a man finally laying down a burden he had carried for too long. "All right, Elara," he whispered, the words of surrender and a vow all in one. "All right, take me home." The commitment was made. Mr. Gable, arriving moments later, found them not as a rescuer and a victim, but as two halves of a whole, clinging to each other in the quiet woods. Together, they fashioned a crude litter from branches and their own coats. The journey back up the slope was grueling, an agonizing ordeal for Silas, but he bore the pain with a stoic silence, his eyes fixed on Alara's face as she walked beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, a constant, reassuring presence. They did not take him to the Gables cabin. They took him to the schoolhouse, his home. They laid him carefully on a bed of blankets near the fire, the same spot where she had first tended to him. Alara, with Mr. Gable's help, set his broken leg, the sound of the bone grating back into place, a sickening counterpoint to Silas's sharp, indrawn breath. He never cried out. He only watched her, his trust in her absolute. In the days that followed, the hollow began to heal. The sheriff came and went, his investigation a formality. Cole's story, combined with the evidence at the scene and the testimony of the hollow folk who despised Barrett, closed the case. It was ruled self-defense. The land, free of Barrett's fraudulent claim, was officially Alara's. The bodies were removed. The community, galvanized by the attack, rallied around her. The men came and repaired the door, patched the walls, and glazed the windows. The women brought food and helped clean, their respect for Alara transformed into a quiet reverence. She was no longer just a teacher. She was their protector, the lioness of the hollow. Through it all, Alara tended to Silas. She was his nurse, his companion, his anchor. She changed his bandages, fed him broth, and read to him in the quiet evenings after the children had gone home. They spoke little, but their silence was filled with a deep, comfortable intimacy. He watched her teach the children, a soft light in his eyes. He saw the way she had woven herself into the fabric of this place, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he wanted to be woven into it as well. One evening, a week after the fight, when his strength had begun to return, he reached out and caught her hand as she passed his bed. "Alara," he said, his voice quiet but strong. She stopped and looked at him, her heart giving a familiar flutter. "Yes, Silas. When I am on my feet," he began, his gaze intense, "I will build you that cabin you and Thomas dreamed of. A proper one, with a real stone hearth, big enough for us, for the children, if they need it, He paused, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "And I will ask you to be my wife. Properly." Tears welled in Alara's eyes, tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She knelt beside him, her hand covering his. "You do not have to ask, Silas," she whispered. "The answer is yes. It will always be yes." He pulled her gently toward him, and she leaned down and kissed him. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, abiding love and profound peace. It was a kiss that sealed a promise made in the heart of a blizzard and forged in the fire of a battle. It was the kiss of a new beginning. The schoolhouse, once a symbol of her desperate solitude, was now filled with hope. The jagged mountains, once her prison, were now the watchful guardians of her home. The man she had once feared as a savage beast was now the gentle, steady center of her world. They were two broken souls who had found each other in the wilderness, and together they had built a fortress of love strong enough to withstand any storm. In the ashes of their old lives, a new one had been born, resilient and bright, a testament to the enduring power of courage and the redemptive nature of love. The resurrected phoenix and the tamed wild had found their home, not in a place, but in each other.